My name's Alexandra Pierce. I'm 26 years old, and until that night, I genuinely believed that family meant safety, meant belonging. I thought it was the one thing you could fall back on when the world got too sharp. But sitting at that dinner table, with the smell of overcooked chicken in the air and the flickering kitchen light above us, I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hand you the knife. Dinner started the way it always did, loud, ordinary, and mildly irritating. My mom, Linda, was recounting her day at the clinic, complaining about her bunions again and how the new nurse didn't know the difference between a thermometer and a tongue depressor. My dad, Richard, sat across from her with his reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose, muttering something about property taxes and how the government was bleeding him dry. I sat between them, quietly eating mashed potatoes that had already gone cold, pretending to listen. That was our family rhythm. They talked, and I faded into the background. I learned years ago that silence was safer than opinions. Every time I tried to share something from work, something small, like a project I'd been proud of or a compliment from my supervisor, it turned into a debate about whether my career path had any real stability. So that evening, I just pushed peas across my plate, counting them as if they could anchor me to patience. But underneath the casual noise, something ugly had been simmering for months, small comments, cold looks, and unspoken resentment I couldn't quite name. And then it happened. Dad slammed his fork against his plate so hard it made Mom jump. The sound was sharp, metallic, final. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Alex," he said, his tone cutting through the room, "either give your room to your sister or pack your things." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. The words felt too absurd to make sense. I glanced at my mom, half expecting her to laugh and tell him to stop being ridiculous. But she didn't. She just looked down at her napkin, twisting it between her fingers like she was trying to wring the tension out of it. Then I looked at Molly, 19 years old, fresh out of high school, with a ring light and a YouTube channel she called Molly Moments. She'd recently declared herself an influencer, which apparently meant everyone in the house had to rearrange their lives around her filming schedule. She'd wanted my room for weeks, said the lighting was better and the walls were a cuter shade of cream. I had brushed it off, thinking no parent would seriously indulge such vanity. But here we were. Molly's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear, playing innocent. "It's not a big deal, Alex," she said sweetly. "You've been here forever. I just need the space for my setup." My pulse pounded in my ears. "You're kicking me out," I said slowly, trying to process the absurdity. "Because she wants better lighting." Dad didn't even look ashamed. "You're an adult," he said flatly. "You've been living here rent-free for too long. It's time you learned what responsibility feels like." I wanted to laugh. Responsibility? I was the only one who paid the electric bill when he forgot. The one who picked Mom up from the clinic after her long shifts. The one who helped Molly apply for college, though she dropped out 2 weeks in. I'd spent years trying to prove that I was worth their pride, worth a little kindness. And this was my reward. A sentence delivered between bites of chicken and mashed potatoes. I looked at Mom again, searching her face for something. Disagreement, regret, even guilt. But she just stared at her plate, nodding faintly as if to agree. That hurt worse than Dad's words. In that moment, the air in the kitchen thickened, pressing against my chest. I felt my throat close, my tongue dry out, my heartbeat echo in my wrists. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to ask why. Why was it so easy for them to discard me like furniture, but no sound came out? So I did the only thing I could to keep what little dignity I had left. I straightened my back and looked my father in the eye. "All right," I said quietly, "I'll go." The silence that followed was suffocating. Molly shifted in her chair, clearly not expecting me to comply so easily. Mom's hand paused mid-air, her fork clinking softly against her plate. Dad just grunted, as if he'd finally checked something off his to-do list. Inside me, something cracked, but it wasn't fragile. It was a clean, sharp break, the kind that makes space for something stronger to grow in its place. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just sat there for a few more seconds, memorizing the scene, the dull yellow walls, the sound of the clock ticking, the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was the moment everything changed, and I wanted to remember it not as the night I lost my family, but as the night I began to find myself. When I stood up, my chair scraped the floor with a low screech that seemed to echo louder than any of our voices. I took my plate to the sink, rinsed it off, and set it carefully in the drying rack, My hands were trembling, but steady enough to hold the edges of my new resolve. Dad didn't say another word, neither did Mom. Molly reached for her phone, pretending to scroll, pretending not to gloat. And me? I walked to my room for one last night, and closed the door softly behind me. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old dreams. I knew, deep down, that something irreversible had happened. I wasn't just leaving a house. I was being forced to grow up in one brutal, unceremonious moment. But even as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the boxes I hadn't yet packed, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their approval. What I needed was freedom. And in that silence, between the beating of my own heart and the muffled laughter of my sister down the hall, I swore to myself, they'll see what happens when the one they pushed away stops asking for a place at the table, and builds her own instead. That night, I packed my things quietly, the way you move in a museum, careful not to touch anything you can't afford to break. Through the thin drywall, Molly's voice floated in a stream of practiced cheer. Hey guys, today I'm doing a deep clean, like a total reset. Drawers clicked, hangers squeaked, the ring light buzzed with a faint electronic purr. She hummed between takes, a light, tuneless sound as if she hadn't just detonated the center of our house. I folded my life along the old creases, sketchbooks with coffee rings and graphite smudges, a handful of model-making blades wrapped in a rag, the chipped mug with the exact curve my thumb had polished smooth, the sweater that still held last winter's cinnamon and smoke. I stacked them with the precision of a junior architect who knows a structure collapses when you pretend weight doesn't matter. My bed, once the softest country I knew, became a staging area, boxes labeled in black marker, kitchen, bath, bookcase, lined up with obedient faces I didn't trust. Mom came to the doorway once, a silhouette framed by the hall light. She held the knob like it might steady her. You know your father, she whispered, eyes skittering past me to the window, the floor, anywhere but the place where I was standing. He just wants you to be independent. Independent. The word struck like a ruler across a child's palm, sharp, corrective, humiliating in its assumption. I had the rent breakdown from my first real pay stub still folded in my back pocket, stained from rubbing. I bought groceries. I paid for the internet and the thermostat batteries and the plumber once, when the downstairs bathroom refused to swallow anything. I learned which coupons were lies, and which could actually shave a number down to something humane. But the lesson in this house wasn't about money. It was about compliance. What they called independence was a door they kept locked from the inside. I lifted the box marked DSK and felt my wrists burn under the unexpected heft of textbooks I'd refused to donate. Structural principles, lighting design, building codes. Knowledge had weight too. Mom lingered like a draft that wouldn't decide which way to blow. I waited for her to say more, to dress the wound with gauze words. We don't mean it like that. It's temporary, I'll talk to him. But she only pulled the door in, almost closed, then left it ajar by an inch, as if mercy could be measured in slivers. I moved like a thief, because I was stealing the only thing I could carry without asking, myself. By midnight, the hall was bare enough that the carpet's crushed track showed where furniture had sat for years. In the kitchen, I'd opened the drawer with the rubber bands and bread ties and pilfered exactly two. One for the broken strap of a garment bag, one for the cord of a desk lamp that had started to fray. Taking more felt like petty larceny. I didn't want anything from them that could accuse me later. The apartment across town was a perfect rectangle with peeling paint that curled like the edges of photographs left in the sun. The heater coughed alive when I turned the dial, clearing its throat the way old men do before they speak. A single window looked onto an alley where a dumpster leaned against the brick like a drunk who didn't want to go home. Still, when I set my boxes down and the door latched behind me with a dull, serious click, the sound filled the room with a kind of stubborn dignity, mine. I assembled a bed from slats and a prayer, placed two mismatched chairs at a table that insisted on wobbling no matter which leg I shimmed. I wiped the counters twice, once for dirt, once for ghosts. The place smelled like stale paint and a dozen strangers' dinners, but beneath that hovered the faintest possibility of fresh bread that hadn't yet been baked. I plugged in the lamp from my old desk and the familiar soft cone of light spilled onto a fresh wall, making a little circle where I could think. The next morning, the world didn't pause to congratulate me. The shower ran lukewarm and metallic, the mirror fogged and refused to clear except for the oval I rubbed with my palm, leaving a print like a giant fingertip. I dressed in yesterday's jeans and a sweater with lint I couldn't pluck fast enough, and I stood in the kitchen of my new life, barefoot on tile that remembered someone else, eating a banana over the sink like an apology. Then I went to work and tried to draw a clean line without my hand shaking. Pain arrived quietly, the way rust does, first a stain you convince yourself you can scrub, then a spread you can't ignore. I missed the unremarkable choreography of home. The scrape of my father's chair at 6 a.m., the sound of Mom's whisk tapping against the bowl on Sundays, the house settling at night with timber sighs that had always felt like a lullaby. I even missed Dad's laugh, the deep, reluctant bark it became when something actually cracked him open. Now every memory came back with an echo, like a room I'd left and then walked past by mistake, hearing my own steps repeat behind me. It would have been easier to be angry all the time, to let rage burn hot enough to cauterize, but anger requires oxygen, and I was rationing mine. The worst moments were small, reaching for a mug I no longer had, hearing a car door slam and thinking it was Dad's truck, catching the scent of pancake batter in the hallway because a neighbor 2 doors down had children and a Sunday ritual, and then there was the glow of my phone in the dark. Molly took my old room within hours. The photo she posted was unmistakable, my bookshelf, stripped and rearranged, my plants, now crowded in the window for aesthetic, leaves turned like listening ears. Finally, a room that fits me, she wrote, thousands of likes, hearts in rows so tight they looked like a rash. And there it was, Mom's comment beneath, pressed like a thumbprint. You deserve it, sweetheart. I stared until the words blurred, until the screen brightened twice to keep me from drowning. Deserve. As if that space had been a throne waiting for its rightful queen. As if I'd have been a squatter in my own life. I muted her updates, then unmuted them, then muted again. Punishment felt like an instrument I didn't know how to play. I typed 3 drafts of a reply and deleted all of them, watching the little cursor blink like a pulse. My chest pulled tight, a drawstring cinched by an invisible hand. I put the phone face down and the silence jumped onto my shoulders, heavier than the box of textbooks had been. The apartment taught me quickly. It taught me which outlets sparked and which were honest. It taught me the exact hour the upstairs neighbor took long showers and sang tunelessly about love. It taught me that city light finds any crack and spills through, so I taped a blanket over the window until I could afford curtains. At night, I placed my palm against the wall to feel the building hum, a shared, complicated heartbeat, and knew that survival is a kind of architecture. You brace, you distribute load, you allow for sway. On my 3rd night, the heater coughed so hard it startled a laugh out of me, the first truthful sound I'd made in days. I sat on the floor, back to the wall, legs out, eating cereal from the box because the spoons were still buried somewhere under BTH or books. I studied the rectangle of lamplight and began, instinctively, to draw the room in my head, measuring with eye and breath, mapping where a small desk might fit, where a shelf could catch the morning if I angled it right. The room had no charm, no stories yet, just plain surfaces waiting for statements. My statements. Grief, I realized, isn't always a flood. Sometimes it comes as paperwork. I started a spreadsheet to keep track of bills and groceries and the narrow space between them. I listed staples in one column, rice, eggs, coffee, apples, and allowed myself one indulgence per week, the way an underlit hallway allows a single window at the end. Choices became studs in a wall. You set them, you hang things on them, you trust they hold. I didn't call home. They didn't call me. In that quiet exchange of nothing, I learned the shape of distance. I learned that dignity has a taste, dry at first, then surprisingly clean. Most nights I fell asleep to the heater's stubborn rattle and woke to the sound of the alley gate clanging open for morning deliveries. Between those 2 sounds, metal to metal, I lived, balancing on a narrow beam that felt just wide enough for one. 6 months after the night I left, the email subject line read like a dare. Piero Amotionen, lead designer. My title added a syllable, my workload multiplied by 10. I said yes before the HR portal finished loading. I was 26, and the firm's boutique housing arm was a small engine that needed every ounce of traction it could get. I became traction. I arrived earlier than the cleaners and left after the street lights clicked on. I ate dinner from a paper box at a drafting table that remembered other young people trying to prove they were more than replaceable labor. Designing homes that felt safe and bright became a private doctrine. Safety not as locks and cameras but as clarity. Layouts that didn't ambush you with dark corners. Entries that didn't force you to turn your back on the world the second you crossed the threshold. bright not as glare, but as the measured invitation of daylight that made the morning feel like a choice you'd made. I sketched kitchens where conversations could travel without shouting, stairs solid enough to earn trust from a tired body, windows that opened like apologies. Every coffee-fueled draft was an argument with the house I grew up in, a rebuttal in plywood and light. The office had a geography of its own, the plotter, grumpy and indispensable. The sample library, a forest of textures you could lose hours inside. Mr. Harper, our director, who wore crisp shirts and believed in giving a young designer a problem just a little too big. He called me to his glass-walled office one gray morning and slid a blue cardstock folder across the desk. "You're young," he said, "but you've got vision. This one's yours to lead." The folder thumped my palm with an unexpected weight. I opened it to cite photos, topographic lines, a preliminary schedule, and then near the back, the address. Oakwood Lane. For a beat, the office noise went thin, the whir of the copier, the phone rings, the faraway laughter from marketing. My childhood street name was printed in a font we used for everything, and yet the letters carried a private electricity. The developer had acquired several lots clustered like puzzle pieces. One sat directly across from the house where I had learned the price of disobedience. Part disbelief, part destiny, something sparked so cleanly inside me I could almost hear it. I did not tell anyone. Not Mr. Harper, not Dana the project manager who could smell drama the way a sailor reads wind, not Louis the contractor who loved solving problems with a pencil behind his ear. I did what the work required. I poured. I visited the site alone at dawn before survey flags fluttered themselves awake. The street was familiar in its bones yet altered by years. New mailboxes, a tree gone, another grown tall. I stood where the future front door would be and watched how the first light lifted from east to west, testing angles with my hands like a director blocking a scene. If safety is clarity, the plan would pivot on sightlines, an entry that aligned with the living core, a kitchen that commanded the yard without turning its back on the door, a staircase tucked but not hidden. The house would be modern in the way good conversation is modern, simple, clean, precise, with just enough warmth to disarm suspicion. In the studio, I mocked up volumes with foam and pins, slicing daylight into the model to watch it travel. Cedar cladding, ventilated rain screen. Standing seam metal roof that would read like a graphite line against winter sky. A band of clear-story windows to float over privacy-height glass. We chose white oak for the floors, not bleached, honest in grain, rift sawn for stability, and a quiet verticality. Concrete slab in the kitchen with embedded hydronic heat, the warmth rising like agreement from the floor. Insulation beyond code. Triple glazed low-E where exposure demanded it, because silence is a kind of safety too. Budgets, like gravity, had their say. Ryan Locke, the developer, wanted a margin that didn't blush. He loved the look but frowned at the numbers. Dana translated my design into spreadsheets and asked where the cost could give without the concept bleeding out. We swapped one imported tile for a domestic that caught light better anyway. We simplified a steel moment frame by thickening a bearing wall and turning it into a built-in bookcase. Structure as furniture, necessity as grace. The city planner, Renee, flagged our front setback by 18 inches. I moved the plane, reclaimed those inches as a planter bench that turned a compliance story into welcome. Community meetings were a chessboard where memories disguised themselves as objections. An older neighbor worried about neighborhood character, by which he meant his memory of Sunday papers on porches. I brought elevations, sun studies, a material board you could touch. "We're not importing an object," I said. "We're completing a sentence the block already started." Renee nodded. The neighbor softened when he learned the siding would silver with time, not shout. Nights ran long. Louis sent me photos of the framing rising like ribs against a blue noon. We argued about a beam depth, then solved it with a dropped soffit that gave the hallway direction. I learned the names of screws and the tolerances of patience. I learned to fight for a 2-inch reveal the way you fight for good manners, because the small things teach the big ones how to behave. All the while, I kept the address to myself. On drawings, Oakwood Lane was just a project code. At lunch, when talk drifted to families, I excused myself to check door swings. I ran in the mornings to clear the silt of adrenaline, then sat with a mortgage calculator at night, teaching my fear to read. I stacked overtime hours and funneled them into a savings account with a name I never said out loud. I negotiated with Mr. Harper for a sliver of the developer bonus, citing leadership and wins. permit approvals on first pass, a VD round that maintained design intent, pre-sales interest tracked in a spreadsheet that glowed green. Construction progressed through seasons. I watched frost lift from the slab, listened to rain move across the metal like a polite drummer, stepped around sawhorses while framing carpenters told stories that made the studs shake with laughter. The staircase arrived in 3 steel flights, powder-coated and perfect, hovering just enough to sense the air underfoot but never doubt its strength. The windows came last, each installed with the ceremony of a lens. Once they were in, the house could finally see. We staged a punch list like a ritual, blue tape constellations dotting walls, notes for paint touch-ups, caulk lines where a steady hand would erase the day's fatigue. In the quiet after trades left, I walked barefoot across the oak, testing for squeaks that didn't exist. At the kitchen island, walnut top, chamfered to invite elbows without leaving dents, I laid my palm flat. The grain ran like a river you could cross. The lights dimmed on a curve I tuned myself. At 30%, the rooms felt like a soft promise. When the appraisal came back, Brian whistled. 1.2, he said, eyes gleaming. We priced accordingly, and then I put my cards on the table. I asked for first right of refusal and invoked the clause in my contract that nobody paid attention to when I was promoted. Employee purchase discount, capped and contingent on performance. Performance had been indisputable. Numbers lined up like soldiers. I had a pre-approval letter, a down payment scraped from raises, bonuses, design awards that came with checks, not just plaques. I had a letter of explanation, short and unornamental, about my relationship to the site, professional, personal, both and neither. Brian looked at Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper looked at me. You earned it, he said. Closing happened under fluorescence that made everyone look like an unflattering truth. The title officer slid forms that clicked as I signed. Alexander Pierce, blue ink, again and again, like tracing a path until it becomes a road. Funds wired. Deed recorded. Keys placed in a small white envelope that crinkled when I pinched it. I didn't celebrate. I stood a moment longer, thumb pressed to the envelope's seam, feeling the tiny serrations of paper against skin, the material fact of a future I had drafted, revised, and permitted into being. Outside, late afternoon sun found a line along the edge of the key and turned it briefly to flame. I slipped it into my pocket. Every cent I'd earned, every sacrifice I'd made, the skipped weekends, the silent mornings, the nights I measured grief against beam spans, had led exactly here, to a house of modern lines and wide windows that would reflect the sunset the way a face reflects a decision. I had drawn a door, and then I had found a way to own the key. The moving truck turned onto Oakwood Lane with the geometry of a ship easing into harbor, gears muttering, hazard lights ticking a metronome into the late morning. I sat in the passenger seat of my car behind it, window cracked, smelling hot brake pads and new cardboard. The air carried cut grass and the sugary ghost of someone's dryer vent. When the truck hissed to a stop at the curb, the street's small ecosystem paused as if to listen. A dog went silent mid-bark, a sprinkler clicked off a beat late, a wind chime across the way forgot its song. My father was already halfway down his lawn with the mower when he looked up. For a second he kept pushing as if the motion could outrun what he saw, and then he froze, one hand on the handle, engine coughing into an uneven idle. The mower blades spun down, a whine giving up to quiet. His eyes jumped from the truck's logo to the open tailgate, to me stepping out of my car with a clipboard and a simple, unshakable calm. Alex, he called, voice pitched over the hush, the same voice that had ordered and scolded and blessed and refused in this rectangle of suburbia. You're buying that house? I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. Not buying, Dad, I said, the words fitting into place like a key turned fully at last. Bought. He stood anchored in a square of sunlight, the mower handle still pressed against his hip like a brace. Something unbuttoned in his face, surprise first, then calculation, then a quick, involuntary flicker of pride. He tamped down so fast you could pretend you hadn't seen it if you wanted to. He looked over his shoulder toward the porch. Mom came out carrying a coffee mug with both hands, not drinking, just holding, the way you hold a fragile thing you might break by naming. She stopped at the top step. The mug hovered just below her chin like a shield with steam. Her gaze moved past me to the gable line, the window band, the shadow of the cantilevered porch, a scan that could have been admiration or interrogation or both. Molly slid into the doorway behind her, phone already lifted like a reflex. The camera lens blinked black as a beetle's eye. She hovered in that indecisive posture of someone who wants to film without being caught wanting to film. The ring light glow from inside the house thinned into daylight, useless here. I raised a hand and waved, easy, cheerful, the gesture small enough to be polite and large enough to be undeniable. Guess I didn't need my old room after all, I said, stepping backward onto my new front step with the balance of someone who knows every rise and run because she drew them. The three faces across the street arranged themselves into a family portrait the street had never seen. Dad squared off and unready, Mom poised between defense and welcome, Molly gripped by the theater of it all. It would have been simple to gloat, to stack old grievances like moving boxes at their feet and invite them to trip, but simplicity was not what today required. Today required clarity. So I held the silence open long enough for reality to take on weight. Behind me, the movers began their choreography. Plastic runners unfurled across the white oak like ribbons for a ceremony. Dollies squeaked. The liftgate clanged, a metal pronouncement. "Where do you want the desk, ma'am?" one asked, his forearms roped with work. "Upstairs," I said, "front room." The words thrilled me. Upstairs, front room. The house spoke in phrases I had chosen, and now it was learning my voice. Neighbors emerged as if pulled by a string. Mrs. Alvarez appeared at her mailbox in gardening gloves, then abandoned pretense and crossed the street with her trowel still in one hand, smiling bright enough to warm paint. "New neighbor?" she asked, though she knew. "Old neighbor," I said, and she laughed. Mr. Keene slowed his evening jog to a theatrical mosey and gave a thumbs up at the cedar siding. He mouthed, "Nice," and trotted on, the soles of his shoes whispering approval. I signed the inventory while the refrigerator hummed itself into the kitchen's corner, a sound like a distant promise. The sofa slid against the wall with a soft exhale. The rug unfurled and found its own gravity, edges relaxing under my palm. Each piece landed with a precise hush, and the house, my house, answered with minute adjustments. A new echo here, a softened edge there, as the rooms accepted weight. I kept catching my father's glance, not direct but grazing, the way people look at an eclipse with everything except their eyes. "Congratulations," Mom called finally, voice careful, as if she were testing a bridge after a flood. The mug had lowered to her waist. Steam thinned into the air and disappeared. I nodded. "Thank you," I said. No other words fit without tearing. Molly, emboldened by the togetherness of an audience, stepped forward to the porch edge. "Is it true?" she asked, phone aimed not at me but at the truck, angling to crop the family out of the scene. "Like you actually own it?" "I do," I said. I didn't look at the phone. I kept my gaze level, steady, scaled precisely for the distance between us and all the distances behind us. By late afternoon the street returned to its normal pulse. The dog remembered to bark. A lawn sprinkler sputtered back into duty and laid a shivering veil over a patch of hydrangeas. Dad restarted the mower and pushed 3 neat lines, then stopped again as if the machine had stuttered on a nail hidden in the grass. He adjusted his cap, a gesture that in our house meant a conversation ending before it began. Mom sat on the porch bench and made herself drink, face framed by the bougainvillea she convinced my father would never survive a winter. It had. Their house, with its angles I knew by muscle memory, looked both smaller and harder than I remembered. I spent the day inside the rhythm of completion. I loaded bowls into cabinets that opened with a soft closing whisper, aligned books so their spines built a quiet skyline, tucked a throw into the corner of a chair with a tuck my hands had practiced in catalogs and rental units and yearning. The new office waited upstairs, patient and bright, a white desk angled to the window like a well-placed confidant. I set my pencil cup down as if laying instruments on a tray before an operation. Dusk gathered carefully, violet and gold sliding along the clerestory. When the mover's taillights disappeared around the bend and the street lamp blinked awake with its habitual 2-second flicker, I carried a bottle of wine up the stairs. The oak underfoot was the exact temperature of my skin. In the office, I leaned one hip against the desk and looked out through the generous pane that faced the only view in the world that could measure this day. Across the street to my parents' house, where porch light cut a pale triangle into the yard and the front window poured a familiar domestic glow. From here I could see the angle into my old bedroom. The curtain was different now, sheer, pale, something that gave the camera light without the clinical glare. On the wall, my former bookshelf had been reconfigured into an altar of packaging and gloss. Molly sat at the vanity where my drafting lamp once bent over math homework and model glue. Her ring light was a second moon in miniature, a perfect white circle that put a halo on everything it touched. She was live, laughing in slices, the kind of laughter that lands without weight, and she was talking about a palette with the reverence of a pilgrim and the expertise of someone who knows exactly where to place brightness on a nose. I unscrewed the cork with a soft knuckling sound, poured into a glass that gathered the room's light and redrew it, and raised it. The rim cooled my lip. The first sip was a small lit fire. I lifted my arm and gave a slow, deliberate wave. No flourish, nothing performative, just a motion with the gravity of a signature. Mid-sentence, her face faltered. It was precise, the way a smile loosened at the right edge. How her eyes darted microsecons off camera to recalibrate. How her spine made an almost imperceptible correction like a dancer catching balance. She saw me. She saw the window, the room, the desk, the certainty gathered into a human shape across the street. The chat. I imagined the flicker of bubbles, the hearts migrating upward, kept stuttering along oblivious. But the person at the center of the picture knew there was another frame, wider than the ring light circle. I didn't smirk. I didn't mouth anything or point or gloat. I simply held the glass at shoulder height a heartbeat longer, then let my hand lower to the desk with a soft contact that only I could hear. In the pain, the evening reflected me back, woman at a window, shoulders squared, house behind her built of lines she drew and choices she carried. Across the street, porch light, family silhouette, the untranslatable murmur of a television turned too low. Night settled with the patience of a craftsman, edges softened, colors deepened into their truer selves. I stood there and watched until the window across the way turned from a stage to a rectangle of ordinary domestic light, until it meant nothing more or less than a room where people lived. Then I took another sip of wine and let the house absorb the sound of my exhale, a small complete punctuation at the end of a sentence I had spent years rewriting. Weeks had a way of settling into the grain of the house, like oil rubbed into a butcher block until the shine wasn't a gloss but a quiet depth. By the time Mom finally crossed the street, the cedar had silvered a breath, the white oak floors knew my footsteps, and the light had memorized where to sit in the afternoons. I heard the soft clap of her flats on the porch before the doorbell rang, one long tone, too long as if she couldn't find the courage to let go. I'd opened to the smell of store-bought flowers and something bittersweet. She stood there with a pie in a foil pan, the crimped edge a little mangled from holding it too hard. I wasn't sure if you liked apple or cherry, she said, eyes moving past my shoulder. So I brought lemon meringue. The peaks had wilted a little, a sugar glisten clung to them like dew that had missed its window to evaporate. Come in, Mom, I said. Her shoulders loosened one notch. She stepped onto the entry's slate tile, glanced down as the soft closed door feathered itself behind us, and exhaled a small, surprised sound architects live for, the involuntary O of a space doing what it should. This house, she whispered, turning slowly, chin lifted the way people do when they want their eyes to touch everything at once. It's beautiful, Alex. You really did all this yourself. Yeah, I said, letting the word land without performance. Turns out I'm pretty independent. She held the pie like an offering and I took it, placing it on the island where the walnut had burnished a shade darker since move-in, heat, sunlight, forearms, decision-making. For a moment we were side by side like we had been 100 times at the old kitchen counter, measuring flour, deciphering recipes clipped from magazines, arguing gently about whether vanilla was a measuring spoon or a feeling. She reached for the meringue peaks with a finger, stopped herself, and wiped her hands on her skirt though there was nothing to dust away. Show me? She asked, small, tentative. I nodded. We moved through the open plan with the slow ceremony of a tour where each room is also a confession. She trailed fingertips along the built-in bookcase that hides a bearing wall, paused at the reveal shadow below the baseboards. What do you call that little line? Anne smiled when I told her it was just air trimmed into purpose. At the window bench she sat and tested the cushion, bounced slightly, surprised by the warmth radiating from the hydronic heat. It's like it's looking out for you, she said. I swallowed at the phrase. We climbed the stair I fought to keep open, stringer steel like a quiet underline, and she rested halfway, palm on the rail, looking back down into the living room where the afternoon was arranging itself in rectangles. Your father didn't mean, she began. I know what he meant, I said, not unkindly, stopping her where the landing turns. And I'm grateful now. You pushed me out, but that's how I learned to stand. The words were not a spear, they were a level laid across the years. She held them, tested them, and I could see the moment they settled in. Her eyes watered, shallow at first, then honest. She nodded once, then again, like a person who has found the right stud behind a wall. In the office, she went straight to the window, both palms on the sill, looking out across the street. Their porch swing creaked, an old rhythm in a new key. The ring light in my former bedroom hung like a pale coin from a fishing line, lifeless in daylight. Mom didn't look at me when she spoke. Your father, she said, believes a push makes people move. He doesn't always see the edge of the cliff. A beat. I do. I saw it. And she stopped, then began again differently. You built a bridge instead. I turned the key on the quiet of that. Ridges don't argue with the chasm. They simply refuse to be swallowed by it. I learned, I said, that the only thing between me and the ground was what I chose to build. We stood in the steady brightness of that room, listening to small noises, the house ticking as its warmth shifted, a sparrow insisting at the eave, the slow discipline of our breathing. She noticed the desk, a plane of white, clean enough to invite work without intimidating it, and lifted the frame that held my first stamp set of the firm. They gave you this? She asked, smiling with the pride of someone who knows how hard it is to be chosen. I bought it, I answered, smiling back. Both stories can be true. Downstairs, I cut the pie, knife slipping through sweet froth to tartness, and we ate from plates that didn't match on stools that did. The lemon was too sweet, the meringue a little rubbery where it had cooled, and yet it was exactly right for what it carried. Effort, apology, memory, a mother's hands learning a new choreography in a daughter's kitchen. After a few bites, she set the fork down carefully, aligning it with the plate's rim, and looked around again, slower this time, as if wanting to memorize the house the way you memorize a new name you do not intend to forget. You always rearranged your room, she said suddenly, laughing soft. Every season, we'd wake up and the bed would be on the opposite wall. Your father said you were restless. I thought, no, she's testing angles, windows, where the morning lands. She gestured toward the Claire story, where the daylight filtered like poured milk. You were always making a place for yourself. I think, I said, I was always learning how to stay. Her hand found mine on the island, light contact, no insistence, and we stood like that, two people whose language had been weather and recipes and worry, trying a new grammar. The silence filled with what we did not have to say enough. In her eyes, regret had loosened its grip, leaving room for something steadier to breathe. Pride is not loud when it is real. It rests its weight without warning, like a cat that chooses your lap and refuses explanation. When she left, she did it the way she had entered, slowly, deliberately, testing each step as if the house might shift under her. At the door, she turned halfway, as if to say more, then thought better of burning a second match and nodded instead. I walked her to the edge of the porch, and we stood together for a breath while the afternoon ripened. She crossed the street with the calm of someone who has remembered her pace. Sun angled low enough to gild her hair and the rim of her mug as she returned with it swinging at her side, empty now, a small vessel that had done its work. The evening painted her in gold and kept painting until she was on the far curb, where shadows met her and took her hand. I stayed at the threshold for a long minute after the door closed, hearing a latch seat itself like a decision finding its verbs. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that wasn't absence but agreement. I washed 2 plates and 1 fork, and the lemon scent beaded up under hot water, breaking open into something tart and clean. On the island, a thin halo of meringue stuck to the wood. I wiped it with a damp cloth and watched the walnut drink the moisture and return to itself. Anger had been a scaffold, useful while the structure rose, ugly when the work was done. I walked through the rooms and could feel, floorboard by floorboard, how much of it I had taken down without noticing. In its place was a simpler frame, acceptance with a good foundation, boundaries plumb and true, a roofline capable of shedding weather without dramatics. Peace, it turned out, wasn't silence. It was a series of choices aligned so neatly that noise had nowhere to snag. I climbed back to the office and stood at the window. Across the street, their porch light hadn't yet clicked on. A bicyclist coasted past, back wheel ticking in the slow applause of a loose spoke. The sky went through its reliable sequence, copper, lavender, then the first clear admission of night. In the glass, my reflection hovered, transparent enough to let the world through, solid enough to remind me who I was. The room smelled faintly of paper and cedar. I rested my palm on the sill and felt the cool certainty of the paint. Independent, I whispered, letting the syllables travel the room like a draft that refreshes without chilling. And finally free. The house didn't answer. It didn't need to. It held the words the way it held light, simply holy, as if it had always been waiting for them to arrive.